of the Essex. Can you hear me, Andy?
I can, Ian. I'm keeping myself mute because of our fan.
Right. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to December's meeting of Essex branch of the Historical Association. We're very pleased today to have Dr. Ben Cowell, the Director General of Historic Houses, which is an independent body of 1,500 historic houses in the country. And he would like to talk today about historic houses today. Thank you very much. We're delighted to see you. Dr. Cowell.
Thank you, Chairman. Very kind, and thank you for inviting me. What I'm going to do is attempt to share my slides, if I may. Now, here we go. So can someone give me the thumbs up that will...
We can see it fine, Ben.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I'm going to give you a talk today, as Ian has just said, about my work at an organisation called Historic Houses. And some of you may have heard of us, some of you may be members, many of you may not be, but we are the representative body for largely privately owned country house properties. And Essex happens to have rather a lot of them, as I'm hoping to show. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the history of these places, largely in the 20th century, and how they've fared, but also talk about historic houses today, because I want to sort of bring it up to date and give just a bit of a flavour of what life is like in these properties now in the early 21st century, and in particular in this era of COVID-19, which has meant that we are meeting in this way rather than meeting in person. I'm very sorry not to be with you in person, but let's proceed anyway. And I hope that you'll be minded to put lots of comment in the chat bar, and there'll be a bit of time for questions at the end, if that's okay. It'll be good to get your thoughts on what I've got to say about the topic. But let me begin by really referring back to an article that appeared in the Essex Review in 1955. And the article was entitled, "What Can We Do with Our Mansions?" And the title really gives the clue to the problem that existed at the time, which was the problem of hundreds of perhaps poorly repaired, sometimes empty, sometimes half ruined houses that littered the landscape, not just in Essex, but across many of the counties of England. And this article was proposing that the future for these houses didn't look particularly bright unless they were repurposed for other uses. It suggested they might become public open places. They might be leased to the county council. They might be converted to schools or to hotels, or used as country clubs, or some other use, golf clubs and so on. It certainly didn't look like these places had much of a future as the places they were built to be, which was grand country residence. Now, I'm pleased to say the subsequent history proved that prognosis wrong. Actually, these places have learnt to survive in all sorts of ways, which I'll try to explain in this talk, and give a bit of a flavour of what we do at Historic Houses. Now, here's my first slide. Just to explain a bit about who we are. This picture, of course, is Leah Marney, Essex's answer to Hampton Court, a very fine early 16th century gatehouse, really. The rest of the house was never completed in the end, but certainly one of our members. here in Essex. I say here in Essex, I am myself an Essex, a proud resident of Essex. So I'm talking as if these places might be familiar to you as well as to me. But this is just simply illustrating the point about who we are at Historic Houses. We are an association. We're a little bit like, I suppose, the National Trust or English Heritage. But both of those organisations are charities, and we're not a charity as such. We're a not-for-profit, but we are ultimately a business association. We represent 1,500, as has been mentioned, different historic house properties across the United Kingdom. So we do work in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, as well as in England. And the places that we represent are your typical country house in many ways. They are the entrance requirements, the requirement to be a member of historic houses, a member property, is that you are grade 1 or grade 2 star listed in England and the equivalent in the other parts of the UK. And that sort of narrows the field a little bit, but the other requirement really is that you're of a particular size and stature, generally speaking, probably more found in a rural setting than in a town. So we don't tend to represent townhouses. We are really about the traditional country house. And our remit extends not just to the structure, the building itself, but also to the contents of that building, the arts collection that has been accumulated within it, which often is part of the story of that place as well, but also its setting, its gardens, its parkland, and the setting around the property. And we really regard them all as a holistic entity. They are an ensemble, if you like. They're the thing that makes the landscape of this country particularly distinctive. And we look after 1,500 of those across the United Kingdom. So in fact, although we are reasonably modest and small as an organisation, in some ways we're much bigger than the other organisations I just mentioned. The National Trust has about 200 country house properties. I think English Heritage has around 50. There's a separate National Trust in Scotland. There's Cadw in Wales. But actually, you can add all the country houses that those organisations own together and still not get anywhere near the number of houses that we represent at historic houses. And of the 1,500 houses that we represent, around 300 are open to the public on a regular basis. They're places you can turn up on an open day and pay an admission fee, or indeed show your historic houses card. So this is the only advert I'm going to show this afternoon, is simply that you can join historic houses as a member of the public, just as you can join the National Trust or English Heritage. And we have a very similar price for our ticket, and it gets you into the houses you can see on this map. 300 or so homes around the country that are all open in different ways to the public throughout the year. And you can see from the pictures I've got here, there is just such a range and a diversity of houses that we're talking about. You might recognise some of these places, particularly the one in the middle, which is Highclere Castle, also known, of course, as Downton Abbey. And one of the ways in which these houses have found to sustain themselves and keep the repair bills paid and keep themselves going is through film and television work. And I suppose Highclere is just one of the most obvious examples at the present time. But if you think of places like Castle Howard in Yorkshire, which was the setting for the famous adaptation of Brideshead Revisited a few years ago now, but countless other places also get used for film productions. And it's our job at historic houses to really advertise these places and market them and reveal how they can be visited. Highclere is not like Downton Abbey in Yorkshire, but is in fact in Berkshire, or actually just over the border in Hampshire. But it's slightly hazy. It has a Berkshire postcode. Anyway, that's the place you certainly can go and visit. In fact, you can visit each of the houses shown here. The one at the top is Holcombe Hall in North Norfolk, which is, I suppose, a very, in some ways, the sort of caricature of the sort of place that we're talking about. That is a very fine early 18th century house set into a vast parkland at the heart of an even larger rural estate. And the estate is still owned and managed by the family who built that house in those early decades in the 18th century. In other words, that house has never once been on the open market. It is still lived in by the Cook family. The current owner is Tom Cook, Lord Leicester, who in fact became the newest member of the House of Lords recently, because as you may know, in our crazy system of democracy in this country, the only bit of the House of Lords that is voted on is the hereditary bit, the 92 seats that are still reserved for hereditary peers. And every time there's a vacancy because of one of them passes away, they have a voter among the rest of them as to who will replace them. And Tom Leicester has just become a member of the House of Lords and gave his speech, in fact, last week. But we're very glad that he's there, because any representation for the sorts of properties we're talking about is particularly useful for our cause at historic houses. The house at the bottom is Hever Castle in Kent, which is the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. Again, privately owned, now in fact run by an educational charity. And I suppose the point here is there's a huge diversity in the sorts of houses that we're talking about. They are very different in terms of their size, their scale, their age, and in fact, in terms of their management and their ownership. Sometimes they're, not that many are run by charities, but a few are. More often they're privately owned and still lived in as domestic residences. And sorry, I am advertising now. So if you become a member of Historic Houses, you get our quarterly magazine, and we delight in sharing the stories about what's happening in these houses, what's in particular happening to the owners of these properties, and how they're finding different ways of keeping them going and keeping the repair bills paid. And if you join us, you can, well, in fact, anyone can download our app and find information about the sorts of places that we're talking about. Now, here in Essex, I mentioned that we've got a lot of examples in Essex. This was a map that I compiled. It's fairly amateurish, therefore, but this was my attempt to try and count the number of places within the county of Essex that might qualify for membership of historic houses. Now, not all of these are members, some of them are, but you remember the qualification was grade 1 or grade 2 star listed, and in some sort of rural setting, a country house type property. Now this list actually includes the relatively few number of National Trust places, for example, and indeed English heritage places. There are only 1 or 2 examples of each. Audley End, which is quite near where I'm sitting to you, talking to you this afternoon, is obviously an English heritage property, as is Hill Hall, which is, I think, in the south of the county. And the National Trust doesn't really have a country house property in Essex. It does own Hatfield Forest, which is the site of a former country house. But the trust itself doesn't particularly own a country house unless you include somewhere like Coggeshall, which is a National Trust property. But this map also includes houses that have ceased to be houses, houses that have fallen down or been demolished or been removed to make way for other uses. And so that's why there's the cluster towards London. Most of those houses, I suspect, in fact, are no longer there. They've been removed to make way for housing, in particular, in between the wars and after the wars. But you can sort of see the distribution of these properties. I suppose the main corridor being that sort of A12 corridor. Essex was a very popular county, a popular place in which to buy an estate and build a house. it has obvious advantages. It's good farming country, but also in reasonable distance of the capital, of course. And so it's been a very popular place to build a house really for the last, 500 years at the very least. And I'll be mentioning quite a few of these houses as I proceed with the rest of my talk this afternoon. These are just a few examples of places, and I think these examples are all going to be historic houses, member properties. This one being Hedingham Castle, of course, in Castle Hedingham, which I suppose is one of the oldest of the properties that we have in membership in Essex, but actually across the country, because this is a 12th century keep, which is a very prominent member of our association. In fact, the owners here, this is Jason and Demetra Lindsay, who live at Hedingham Castle with their family. And Jason happens to be our deputy president at Historic Houses. So in, I think, 3 years' time, Jason will take over as the president of our organization, which is, I'm very pleased about, being a proud resident of Essex, as I've mentioned. But Jason and Demetra manage this place. They very much run the castle as a wedding venue, and they've spent a lot of time and effort in recent years modernizing the interior of the keep, which is, as you will know, a very fine example of 12th century architecture indeed. But they've got now, I think, on the ground floor and the lower floor, sort of facilities for running lovely wedding parties and wedding breakfasts and all sorts of discos and disco balls and all sorts of things. And of course, they live in the Georgian house next door to this castle. They don't live in the castle, though the last time I was there, which was a few months ago, they were in the process of converting a room at the top of the castle into a bridal suite for the wedding couple to spend the night in the castle after their ceremony. But weddings, as we'll see, have been big news for these sorts of places. And here are just some more examples of the places I'm talking about, which I'm sure you will know, probably you will know much better than I do. But Ingatstone is a very good example and is also a prominent member of our association, and as is Horham Hall. And these, I think, are places that were certainly on the royal progression route in the 16th century. So royal visitors would have come here, whether Henry VIII or Queen Elizabeth. Essex was a happy hunting ground for the monarchs of the 16th century before they all headed west of London rather than east of London. Places like Blake Hall are typical as well of Essex. Slightly later buildings. This is, I think, a 17th century house refashioned in the early 19th century by Beseavy, but remains a family-owned house. The Capel-Cure family lives there now. Has also become a prominent wedding venue and a very busy wedding venue in normal times. I think it's the wing of the house on the left that was converted into an RAF operations base during the war. And when I visited last, which was a good 2 or 3 years ago now, the wing was still very much gutted, but you could still see evidence of that RAF operations base in existence. The family was in the process of returning it back into being part of the family home. And this is a place called Barrington. I think it's near Hatfield Forest. I'm afraid I don't know too much about this one, but I know it had various 19th century embellishments to the house, sort of neo-Gothicization in the 19th century, and has subsequently become offices rather than domestic residences. And this is also a place, I think, near Hatfield Forest, Down Hall, which I believe is now a hotel. And you do often find these sorts of places becoming used as hotels or offices, but it's not necessarily the thing that we like to advocate at historic houses. We're much more in favour of these places remaining as homes, because that's what they were built to be. It is a precondition of membership that places have to have been built as houses. They can't just be places that have been subsequently converted into homes. The preference is for places that were built as houses and indeed that remain as houses. And one of the ways in which I'll come back to Braxton in a moment. Braxton is now principally a wedding venue, but a very fine 18th century home. But one of the ways we advertise ourselves or talk about ourselves is as a domestic entity. These are places where families still live, where you will still find children's toys in the perched on the outstretched arms of the classical statues. They are places that remain homes. We are historic houses, but we are also homes. People are still having families and living in these places, getting married, raising children. This is very much on the right-hand side of the picture, the current Countess of Devon, who is a charming American actor called A.J. Langer, who married the Earl of Devon and now lives at Powderham and has in many ways revolutionized the way they show that particular house. It's now a house devoted to well-being and health and yoga and fitness and mental well-being are at the heart of what they do. No longer do you go to Powderham and traipse around the Great Hall behind a velvet rope. You're going there to do yoga in the Great Hall. So these are places that are constantly in the process of change. They're being reinvented by new generations. They may have been in the same family for 800 years, but new generations are coming along all the time and bringing new ideas and new thoughts. And that's really what makes these places different from sort of being museum pieces. We still have children growing up there, reading their Harry Potter books and leaving them on the shelves in the 18th century library. And owners are beset by the issue of how to keep these places going. It is not easy. And this is one of our owners who works very hard. This is the owner of Tissington Hall in Derbyshire, where, again, a wedding venue, but a very fine house with a fine collection, where the owners just work day and night tirelessly just to keep the property intact, to keep the roof from leaking, to keep the windows repaired, and it's not an easy job at all. But really, I suppose the historical bit of the story I'm telling is the fact that for the last 150 years or so, these houses have been beset by all sorts of problems. If we go back to the end of the 19th century, we have the beginning of the national love affair with country houses. That was the first time when country life appeared on the newsstands, I think in 1894 or thereabouts. Around the same time, in fact, that the National Trust was invented in the 1890s, a time when we were becoming a very industrialized nation, but at the same time, learning and growing our love of the countryside and country houses in particular. But this was also a time when landowners were beset by all sorts of problems. We had a very bad agricultural depression from the 1870s onwards. So landowners were suffering from a loss of income. But at the same time, we faced, or the nation had, a very active political debate about land ownership in the later decades of the 19th century. We sort of sometimes think that debates about land ownership and land reform might be somehow modern obsessions. Books like, there's a book that came out in recent years called Who Owns England? A sort of expose of land ownership and inequality of land ownership. This was very much happening in the 19th century. This gentleman is Sir William Harcourt, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Gladstone's administration, I think also in 1894. But the Liberal Party at that time did have a very active land reform debate happening. And this was really prompted by a publication that came out in 1873, The Modern Doomsday, organized by John Bateman, who I think had an estate in Essex, interestingly enough. He was a landowner in Essex, but Bateman had instigated in 1873 this thing called the return of owners of land, the so-called modern doomsday, which was an attempt really to keep the land reformists quiet. His intention was to do a huge survey of land ownership and prove that in fact land ownership was widespread and that land was fairly equitably shared, even if there were the landlords who did own rather large estates. In fact, the return of the owners of land of 1873 proved the exact opposite. It proved that land ownership was highly concentrated in this country in the hands of relatively few people. There were perhaps 700 families who owned the vast majority of the land in this country. It was highly consolidated within relatively few aristocratic and gentry hands. And that really prompted a political debate, a debate within the Liberal Party, but also more reformist parties beyond the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party was under pressure to do something about this, to sort of pacify the more radical ends of the spectrum, the political spectrum, certainly within its own ranks. And so William Harcourt in 1894 introduced the first estate duty, the first effective death duty on landed property. And it was a modest amount. I think it might have been 1% on properties valued at £1 million or more, or something like that, payable on the death of the owner. But it was the first time really that a substantial capital tax had been levied on these sorts of estates. Now, William Harcourt, in some ways, it was a Pyrrhic victory for Sir William, because Sir William was the second son of a landed family which owned this house, Newnham Courtney. And everyone said at the time, well, he's only doing it because he is the second son. He's getting his revenge on his brother for not inheriting this particular property. But sadly for Sir William, he does in the end end up inheriting this property when his brother unexpectedly dies without issue. And so William Harcourt, in fact, inherits Newnham Courtney with 2 lots of death duties. And in the end, the family can't afford to keep this house going. And they sell it, I think, in the 1930s. They sell it altogether. So what was perceived as an anti-landlord measure did come back to bite William Harcourt himself. I suppose this is really the setting for then what happens to the country house in the early decades of the 20th century. Now, houses come and go all the time, and they always have done. And they've been beset by fire, for example. This example, which is from Essex, you might know this place, Copt Hall. You can see it if you're driving along the M25, heading towards the Dartford crossing, or the Thurrock crossing, as I prefer to call it. But this is Copt Hall, which was a very magnificent mansion full of rather lavish decoration and furniture and so on, and suffered a huge fire in 1917, which as a consequence, it's never really recovered from. But now, finally, is in fact in the ownership of a very active local trust who are slowly bringing it back to life. The first thing they did was put a roof on the property. And once they've got the place watertight and secure, they are now going about restoring individual rooms within the house and doing a fantastic job in the process. But I suppose that's an indication that houses do come and go for all sorts of reasons. But there was a particular spate of demolitions of houses really in the middle decades of the 20th century. This is not an Essex example. I think this is an example from Suffolk in the early 1950s. But this was not an uncommon sight in Essex back in the day. So this is an example of a house no longer there. This is Screens, I think sold in 1927. And by then, you see, the owners of these places simply found they couldn't afford to keep them going. Such was the cost of repairing these mansions that it made more economic sense for them to pull them down, to sell the materials and the collections inside, the furniture and so on, to sell those off, and often to sell the land, whether for development or for farmland. As it happens, the land at Screens was, I think, gifted to an organisation to host holidays for families from the East End of London, and has now become in the ownership of the Scout Association, which is how I managed to visit and take the photograph of that caravan there, which I think is the site of where the house would have been. I'm not entirely sure, but anyway, it's now a Scout adventure camp in the heart of Essex. And this is another example of an Essex mansion, which is famously no longer there. This is Easton Lodge, of course, the home of the remarkable Daisy, Countess of Warwick, who had a fine old time at Easton Lodge in the later decades of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Of course, tried to give it to the Labour Party at one point. But in the end, after the house was taken over, the grounds taken over as I think a US Air Force base in the war, the Countess of Warwick's son, when he inherited the property, decided after the war he couldn't keep it going, and the place is no longer there. That's all you can see of Easton Lodge these days, of course. Demolished, like so many of these places were in the early 1950s. And this is an example near me. I live in Newport, outside Saffron Walden, and this is the house that would have been on the hill overlooking the village of Newport in the 19th century. And the gates to this house are still there at the northern end of our village. Now, in fact, this was a house that burnt down in 1966 in slightly mysterious circumstances, which was proven in law when the owner, an associate of the Cray twins, so we're told, was then put away in prison for a succession of mysterious country house fires. And this house, therefore, the one you can see here, is no longer there. But a new house was built on the foundations and is still very much a country house property here in Essex. When I tried to calculate the losses in Essex, these are the numbers I came up with. There's a very good website called Lost Heritage, which tries to list all of the country houses that have been demolished in this country. And I think there are nearly 2,000. I think it's just under 2,000 currently listed on that website. It's called Lost Heritage. When you look at the list for Essex and for the 20th century, this is what you see. And as you can see from the crude numbers here, the peak decade for country house demolitions was the 1950s, when 16 of these houses were lost from the Essex landscape altogether. But that process carried on into the 60s and indeed the 70s, despite the fact that the listing of buildings came in 1947. I suppose the key measure there was listing came in 1947, but the protection for listing didn't come in until much later, until 1968. And that might give you some indication about the pattern of the numbers seen there. But certainly after the war, owners were making very rational, unsentimental decisions to limit their liabilities by selling off the property in its entirety. Now, I suppose that's the setting for why the National Trust has become the organisation that it's become. It was given the powers in 1937 to really take on country houses in a proper way. It was always kind of interested in country houses, but began as a landscape organisation rather than a country house organisation. But when in the 1930s, this pattern of demolition was becoming apparent, there was much lobbying to change the powers of the National Trust. And in 1937, they were given greater powers to take on these complicated rural estates. Now, the consequence of that was they started drawing up a list of all the houses they'd like to get their hands on. And this is from the National Trust archives. This is a list of the Essex houses the Trust had its eye on back in 1939. And you can see the top of the list there, alphabetically, but perhaps in other ways as well, was Audley End. The Trust had an active policy to try and acquire Audley End House, among others. As we know, or as we've heard already, they didn't in fact acquire any of these properties, and most of them remain privately owned houses. I've already mentioned Horham Hall, Leamani, Lees Priory is another good example of a wedding venue. Spain's Hall, I think, is now owned by Jamie Oliver. In fact, I think he bought it in recent years, but they all continue to be privately owned houses. And Audley End is not a National Trust property, because actually, although the National Trust spent much energy, maybe five or 6 years or so after about 1944, trying to work with Lord Braybrooke to find a way by which it could acquire Audley End. In fact, what happened with Audley End was the Labour government of Clement Attlee stepped in 1948 and bought Audley End from Lord Braybrooke. Lord Braybrooke, again, was another example of an owner who inherited the property with 2 sets of death duties, because the 7th Lord Braybrooke and the 8th Lord Braybrooke had died within I think within the same year in 1942. And the 9th Lord Braybrooke was a cousin who was not expecting to inherit and knew that he could not continue to live at Audley End once it had been returned to the family after the war. It was taken over during the war as a special operations executive base. And Lord Braybrooke was looking for ways in which his family inheritance could be passed on intact, and had hoped the National Trust would take it on. But in the end, the government bought it, I think for something like £30,000. And it opened up to the public back in 1949, I think it was, and has done incredibly well ever since. But this problem about country houses, I think Clement Attlee's government knew at the time was not going to go away. And they were simply not able to buy every country house that found itself in problems. And so what they did was establish a committee to investigate the problem, the sort of age-old way of governments finding solutions. And they appointed Ernest Gowers, the gentleman you can see on the left here, to investigate what were the options that the government had for making sure that not that the sort of the rot, as it were, could be stopped, that some of these houses could in fact be saved from demolition and from fading away entirely from the English landscape. And Ernest Gowers assembles a committee of people that included people like Cyril Fox, the director of the National Museum of Wales, and also Sir Anthony Blunt, the keeper of the King's pictures, who you can see at the bottom of the screen there, who was, we later found out, he did have a second job at the time, but we'll skate over that perhaps for the purposes of this talk. They investigated the problem of the country house for a couple of years and reported in 1950, so 71 years ago this year, but were left in no doubt that there was a significant problem, that these places were in the process of decay and fading away in front of their eyes, that they were under so much pressure from declining incomes, increases in taxation, that they simply had to, there was a sort of pattern which led to the collection being sold off, the land being sold off, the timber being sold off, and eventually the house itself being broken up and sold off for its materials. Now, the solution that they came up with may not have been the solution that the Labour government was expecting. Perhaps the Labour government of the time, the government that of course invented the National Health Service and nationalised huge parts of industry, might have thought the committee would recommend that it should be the saviour of the country house and should really build up its collection of country houses to sit alongside Audley End. But in fact, the committee reported the exact opposite. Their recommendation back in 1950 was that these houses, the best way to preserve them was for them to stay as houses, for them to continue to be privately owned domestic residences, preferably indeed owned by the families connected with them, the families perhaps who had built them in the first place, who certainly had collections of artworks within them. Now, this might have been a controversial recommendation for the post-war Labour government. It might not have been what they were expecting to hear, and certainly they declined to introduce many of the measures that the Gowers Committee had recommended, which were along the lines of tax breaks for the owners of these properties and new systems of financial grant for the owners of these houses. But actually, over the years, they are the sorts of things that have been introduced by successive governments, and I think have led to these houses surviving in the way they do today. The process of destruction went on really into the early 1970s. There was a famous exhibition at the V&A in 1974, which really was kind of raising the profile of the problem. And the problem was really one about maintenance. These are present day figures rather than historic figures. But my rough rule of thumb is that you need about £100,000 a year just to keep still in these places. They're not cheap places to own. So the question is, where do you find that sort of income? And part of our job is talking to government about the situation that the owners of these properties, those who have inherited these houses, are facing, because I suppose they could, all of them, they are capital rich, but are often quite cash poor. They could realize their assets by selling them, but that would lead to a diminution of public access in many cases, is what we feel. And so that's the basis of the case we make to government. And the classic way in which these places keep going is continues to be by sale. The sale of works of art from collections is typically, and this is a figure from a survey we did a few years ago, 1 in 6 of our owners had sold a work of art in order to fund a repair bill. That's simply the way in which you go about making sure you've got the wherewithal to keep your property intact. Now, the mid-1970s was also a time of political upheaval. The government, another Labour government in the mid-1970s, was talking of new forms of wealth tax. Dennis Healey introduced the capital transfer tax and was talking about introducing yet further capital taxation measures, but met some stiff resistance, not least from supporters of our own organisation, which was founded in the early 1970s, but also from the likes of NADFAS. And here they are carrying a petition to Dennis Healey in 1976 against sort of stringent taxation on the assets of these houses. And in fact, Dennis Healey, I think, is responsible for introducing a significant change to the fiscal landscape for these properties in 1976, when he extends the grounds on which you could seek what's called conditional exemption. This agreement whereby, provided you open your property to the public for at least 28 days of the year, the inheritance tax is not, it's not eliminated, but it's temporarily waived until such time as the property passes once again to the next generation. But that, I think, has changed the landscape for many of these houses. And in my view, the situation in many ways really changes after about 1976. Not a coincidence at all. Economic revival and that change in the tax arrangement has meant that many of these properties have now really revived since those dark days of the early 1970s. We now estimate that these places generate about £1 billion of tourism income, or at least they did until COVID hit. And this helps to generate lots and lots of jobs. We reckon that about 26 million visits are made to the 300 or so historic houses places that are open to the public, which is a very large number. It's roughly equivalent to the visitors to National Trust mansions. Perhaps not the landscapes owned by the National Trust, but certainly the pay for entry houses at the National Trust have a similar number of visitors visiting them every year. And nearly half of all the people coming to this country on holiday say they come to visit historic houses or castles. So these are, we think, a significant part of our economy. And in many ways, the success of the country house in the modern era has been down to the way in which they've diversified. They found new ways of making money. They might be doing weddings, they might be doing events, they might be putting on holiday accommodation. This is Nebworth in Hertfordshire with its big festival, Dogfest, and also the How to Train Your Dragon event that they did there. I think these are pictures from this summer. And many of these places have been in rude health through this sort of enterprising initiative to bring new audiences in and try to make money. I just want to, I probably ought to whiz through my slides. I realize now I've probably got rather too many, but I'll try and whiz through the rest of this talk and say a little bit about what's happened in recent times, because of course, much of that diversification has been hit hard by COVID. All of these places had to close their doors during the first lockdown, and re-emerging from lockdown has been pretty hard work. There's been lots of media fascination with what it's like to be in these properties. After all, you couldn't think of a better place to enforce social distancing than if you happen to live in one of these houses. But it was a particularly lonely time to be living in one of these houses when there were no visitors at all. And more to the point, they lost quite a lot of income from trading, from welcoming visitors, from hosting weddings and all sorts of things. And the bottom headline there really touches on another aspect of historic houses today, this really strange or I suppose interesting turn which happened last year, where heritage was brought into the debates that were happening following the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd in America, and the Black Lives Matter movement. And the National Trust got into some trouble when it started, it published a report into the houses that it does own and their links to colonialization and the slave trade. And this is a statue that was outside of a National Trust property in the Northwest, Dunham Massey, but is not there anymore. It was taken down because of the furor around that sort of the links between National Trust properties and historic houses and the colonial past of this country, which has been a kind of a point of debate within the historic houses in recent years, as you can imagine. But COVID really has been the biggest issue they've had to tackle, simply because of the economic impact that it's had. Places were shut, places had to close their doors entirely, and a large part of what we were doing as historic houses was working hard to talk to government ministers about ways in which places like this could reopen in COVID secure ways and start to welcome visitors back again. This is pictures from Audley End of the different ways in which the visitor route had to be adjusted to allow people to come back safely. Here we are, this is our president, Martha Lytton-Cobbold, talking to Oliver Dowden when he was the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. And this is the inside of Nebworth House in Hertfordshire, where Martha lives. And this is Nigel Huddleston, the Heritage Minister, who we talk to all the time, who's been a great advocate for the livelihood of the owners of historic houses places. This is a property, I think this is Arley Hall again in the northwest of England. But we were talking to government all the time about different ways in which they might change the regulations to allow visitors once again to visit these properties. Many of them made use of temporary outdoor marquees, but there's a whole world of regulations attached to putting up a marquee in the grounds of a listed building. So we were getting deep into the detail of the planning laws that surround these sorts of properties. We were helping the member properties of historic houses to understand the regulations and to develop COVID secure ways of opening up again. And the properties themselves were finding all sorts of new and interesting ways to do exactly that. This is the drive-in cinema at Nebworth, a very enterprising way to put on a socially distanced, COVID secure way of visiting Nebworth without you having to actually interact with other people face to face by listening to the cinema while sat in your car still. Places like Leomani have developed their glamping facilities. You can go glamping in Leomani these days and have your holiday there, and staycationing has become a very popular part of what we do at historic houses. And the same thing goes for weddings. Weddings were perhaps the hardest hit bit of historic house business in the last, well, nearly 2 years now. I mentioned that weddings were a particularly popular part of historic house enterprise. About 500 of our 1,500 properties offer themselves as wedding venues. And weddings were, as many of you will know, the thing that were hit the hardest by the regulations in each of the lockdowns that we've had so far. I think initially weddings you couldn't have at all, except in very extreme circumstances. And then weddings for 6 people and then 30 people were allowed. And the picture at the bottom right of this screen is the way in which Braxted Park got around this by doing a drive-in wedding for a couple of theirs last autumn, which I thought was a particularly innovative way of meeting the COVID lockdown restrictions while still allowing a wedding to take place. The properties have benefited from the support that's been on offer from government. The furlough scheme and so on led to thousands of people having their jobs saved because of during the periods of lockdown, but also the culture recovery funds that the government set up, £2 billion worth nearly, which has had a huge impact on heritage and other parts of the arts sector, and has, this, I think, again, this is Nebworth, and the repairs underway at Nebworth, thanks to a grant from the Culture Recovery Fund. And that's kept not only the houses in good repair, but it's also kept local firms that supply those houses, the stonemasons, the roof repairers, the plasterers, and so on. It's kept them in work during the difficult months that we've had in the COVID-19 era. Because at the end of the day, these properties don't really have any sources of public support in normal times. They don't often get grants from government. They are not able as much to access things like the national lottery. There's a cap on the amount that private owners can apply to the lottery by way of support. And it certainly doesn't extend to structural capital repairs in the same way in most circumstances. The only charity really that gives money to privately owned historic houses is the Historic Houses Foundation, which in many ways is our sister organisation. It is a charitable trust, and it does exist to look after houses of the kind that I've been talking about. And they are always incredibly grateful for donations that they receive. They're looking at the moment for to raise about £5 million to double an offer that they've had for a donation, which would extend their endowment and enable them to carry on funding repairs in these properties in a way that normally can't be done. But that Culture Recovery Fund, I think, has been absolutely invaluable for those members of ours who were able to benefit from it. And I think it's over 100 historic houses places in England have benefited from money from the government during this difficult time. And it's meant that they've been able to survive. They've not had to make staff redundant, and they've not had to sell off assets, whether collections or land or buildings. But I suppose I want to end with this gentleman. This is of course, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak. And whenever a budget comes around, a big part of my job is firstly trying to influence that budget, which is quite a hard job to do. But secondly, to make sure that the members of historic houses understand what the implications of the budget might be, because actually the fiscal framework, as well as the framework around things like the planning system, matters hugely to these places. And every time there's a budget, we have to look very hard at the small print to see what might be happening to, particularly to the taxes that apply to capital assets. And our strong argument is that provided those places are open to the public, they are going to be providing public benefit. They're providing benefit to the nation. It's important that these places are kept going in their own right because they are important listed properties. but also important for the economy, for attracting people to this country, and for providing economic stimulus, particularly in rural parts of the country. We think they've got an important role to play in agendas like levelling up and in providing opportunities for people to learn apprenticeships and so on. And so we're always looking and advocating for a fairer tax framework for these sorts of properties. These properties can pay significant amounts in business rates. They can pay enormous amounts in things like VAT. They can certainly have to pay huge amounts of capital tax. Inheritance tax is currently at 40%. And so if you don't make an arrangement for your property, actually that's a sort of existential issue if then a 40% charge is charged to the estate on a death. So watching what the government does and trying to influence that is a big part of what we do, alongside generally promoting what life is like for these houses in the present day. And I think I've probably talked myself out of the time available, but I'm very happy to end the presentation there and perhaps take any questions that people might want to stay on to do. Oh, somebody's asked a question in the chat, which is, Peter's asked about Grimsthorpe. He says he recently visited Grimsthorpe, which is in Lincolnshire. Grimsthorpe Castle, is it one of yours? It was making a big thing of Halloween. Peter, definitely one of ours. Grimsthorpe is very much a Historic Houses member. I think it is a charity, actually. About 50 of our 1,500 properties are run as charities. It does extremely well. And Halloween definitely is big business these days. There's another property near Grimsthorpe called Doddington, which is a lovely house, very nice house indeed. But they also make a big thing of Halloween. They grow lots of their own produce, but they didn't grow enough pumpkins, so they had to buy huge numbers of pumpkins and then leave them on the field in order to do their pick your own pumpkin enterprise that they had underway during Halloween. So there we go. Grimsthorpe and Doddington definitely are Lincolnshire members of ours. So here we are. There's another question here from Martin. How does Historic Houses and house owners cope with the recent trend to publicise the links to slavery? I mentioned that in the course of my talk, as well as artifacts acquired on the profits of slavery. Now, Martin, that's a really good question, and it's fascinating, and it's obviously one where the National Trust has been doing great work to do exactly that, but not without attracting a fair bit of criticism from some quarters who said, this isn't the sort of thing the National Trust should be doing. It's all very politically correct, and why on earth are they going on about these things that happened in the long distant past when they should just be concentrating on, giving people great days out and nice cups of tea and cream scones and so on. Well, that's a view which many people hold, but I believe it's also the view that the Trust was right to do the work it's been doing, and the Charity Commission thought the same, more or less, but this remains a difficult issue. Not difficult because necessarily we have, our owners have things to hide, but just because it clearly is something, unless you do it right and do it properly, you can start to upset people or offend people or do things wrong. But I do believe it's the right thing to explore this territory and to be transparent about the origins of wealth. And I can point to quite a few of our member properties who are doing exactly that. If you go to Harwood House in Yorkshire these days, that's near Leeds, very, very large, beautiful house with an amazing collection inside. But the Lascelles family has made no secret of the fact that that collection and that house was funded through profits from slavery and the slave trade. In fact, they've made it their business to tell that story. If you go to the website of Harwood Hall, you can see all sorts of information about it. And I recently, just this week, I I bought a copy of this book, which is called Blood Legacy. It just came out earlier this year. It's by someone called Alex Renton, Blood Legacy. And it's about a house in Scotland called Kilkerran. And Alex Renton has used the family archives to tell the story of the wealth of that family. And in fact, I've lined up Alex to talk at an event that we're doing in January to talk about exactly this issue. So there'll be more of this to hear in the future. Can everyone still hear me? It's a sort of very strange thing talking into a void.
You're fine now.
Yeah, we lost you briefly just now.
Oh, did you? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Yes, it said my internet was unstable.
Yes.
Did you hear me talking about this book and about Alex Renton?
Yes.
But,
Yes.
I won't repeat it necessarily.
I think we heard you. We just stopped for a second. Are there any more questions, either through chat or if you want to raise your hand or put up one of the little symbols? Any more questions from anybody? I can't see anybody else with a question.
In which case, Andy, can I step in?
Please.
Can I call upon Shirley Durgan to propose a vote of thanks for a very fine talk? Shirley?
Hi, Ben. I'm very pleased to say thank you because I collaborated with Ben on Victoria County History short book on Newport. There was a very keen group and very able group of volunteers there. In fact, we have had a talk from another one of the group a few years back. Professor Anthony Tuck gave us a talk a few years back. So thank you very much, Ben. Great to see you. Great talk. I must confess, I'd never heard of your organisation. So I'll come clean on that. So it was very interesting to hear about it and to know that there are so many places in Essex as well. In the lockdowns, well, not in the lockdowns, in the COVID period, I've been walking a lot in Essex and visiting lots of places. They were closed, of course, that I'd never seen before and got much more familiar with Essex. And now here's a chance to get even more familiar. So thank you very much, Ben. Very interesting. Thanks.
Can we show our appreciation, please?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Lovely to see you again, Shirley, and thank you for that as well.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cowell. What a treat for us all. Can I suggest to people that they tarry a while if they wish, and even if they don't, to think about how they may help our branch. We would love to have people who could be interested in seeing what the branch committee do and how we go about our work. So don't think you have to dash away. We can no longer associate properly with coffee, tea and biscuits, unless you get your own in a moment, but we can stay and have a little chat. Oh, and I'll echo Shirley's thoughts. Love the talk. So many places we know and visit. I mean, we like it when Essex gets a mention, but we rarely get a chance when Essex stars like that. We are thrilled to bits. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ian. I can see another question's appeared in the chat, which is quite interesting. Oh, well, Sue has said that she receives our newsletter, so thank you, Sue. And that you can go on our website. That's another advert for us there. That was a gift. But you can go on our website and you can sign up for the email without having to become a member. So please do that. But John, you've asked a very, very pertinent question about historical context. Of course, that is not always a particularly pleasant context, because that's a context that can be about exploitation. It can be about not just slavery and the slave trade, but also industrialization. It can be about mine owning, factories and so forth, as you said there. And, you know, you've hit the nail on the head in some ways. I suppose my response to that would be that I'm always struck by how little sort of aggressive feeling towards the owners of these properties there's been historically even if you could argue that they're, you know, in that way, they some of the wealth is.
I'm not quite. I think Lloyd George actually did focus quite a lot of aggression